Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to another Hobby Hour tutorial. Let's paint this absolute beast of a Tyranid model, the Norn Emissary, using contrast paints and layered highlights. There are some prominent gaps and seams on this model, and I wanted to show an easy way to fill them in. On large, flat areas, put a little extra plastic cement in the joint. When you put the parts together, it should ooze out and form a seam like this. Don't wipe that away, because once it dries, we'll be able to file it smooth and it will fill in the gap. If the glue trick doesn't quite fill in the gap, you can use some sprue goo. This is a mix of Tamiya Extra Thin cement and chopped up pieces of plastic sprues. Brush some of this in the gap, let it dry, and then you can carve it away. Juan Hidalgo has a great tutorial about making sprue goo, and you should check it out if you've never made it before. I assembled the whole model, but I kept the head separate. I glued a piece of wire inside the neck and attached it to a cork. Then I gave the model an undercoat of gray primer, followed by a zenithal style spray from the top and sides with Wraithbone. I used my airbrush to prime this model, but if you want to see how I prime with cans, check out the beginning of my Neurolictor video. I'm starting with some skeleton horde just like my other Tyranids, but this time I'm diluting it with equal parts contrast medium. Contrast paint tends to look uneven on larger surfaces, and since this is a really big model, I'm going to apply the base coat in 2 layers. Apply the diluted paint just like you normally would. Focus on keeping it even, let it pool a little bit to create shading, but not too much. On the more broad areas like the tail, try to apply it as even and smooth as possible. It will save time on highlighting later. Next I took some skeleton horde on its own and applied it into the deepest recesses, in between the joints, the pits and the divots, and anywhere else to reinforce the shading. With the skeleton horde dry, I highlighted the skin with a dry brush of Bonewhite. Some areas may look a little spotty or uneven, which can happen with dry brushing. We'll fix that later with some glazing. Now it's time to add some color to the skin with Magos purple and a blended effect. Magos purple is a very transparent color, which makes it easy to blend. Just paint it on one section, rinse the brush, wipe it off on a paper towel, and then use the clean brush to blend to the edge. Once you paint an area, try not to touch it again until it dries. I applied several coats to reinforce the color, concentrating more of the paint near the end of each appendage. I used some pink horror and base coated these things at the end of the tentacles, the tongue, and the details around the brain. After those pink base coats were dry, I shaded them with some Magos purple. You may want to apply a second layer of the purple to deepen the color. Now for all the red scales. I mixed up a whole pot of this color, which is 3 parts Flesh Terror's red and 1 part Black Templar. Check out this video here if you want to see how I mixed it. Work on one section at a time and try to keep the paint smooth and even. If any areas look a little thin or spotty, that's okay. Just let it dry and you can apply a second thin coat after to even it out. I want to have a blended effect on the head spikes, going from red to black, so I'll start out by blending the red at the bottom. This technique is the same as what I did with the purple. Just paint the bottom half, rinse the brush, wipe it off on a paper towel, and then use the clean brush to blend the edge. You'll probably have to rinse the brush and repeat a couple times to get it smooth. Don't worry about getting it perfect here. Once we blend the black paint in the opposite direction, it will smooth everything out. I used another custom mix for the claws. This is about 4 parts Black Templar to 1 part Incubi Darkness. The Incubi Darkness is an opaque color, and by mixing it with the Black Templar, it accomplishes a couple different things. It makes the finish a little more even and smooth, so we can usually save some time and get away with just 1 coat. Black Templar has a cool tone to it, but this mix makes it a little bluer, and that will help better relate to the highlights that will go on top of it. Now we'll blend the head spikes in the other direction, and the technique works just the same. Paint the black mix, then quickly rinse and wipe off the brush, and then use the clean brush to blend the edge. Next I painted all the brains with Demonette hide. I prefer using this to base coat rather than contrast paint for a couple reasons. The main one is time. Since contrast paint is transparent, it needs a light undercoat in order to work. The red scale color spilled over on some of the brains, and I'd have to touch that up with Wraithbone first. Wraithbone is a weak color and would take a few layers to completely cover up the red. That's a lot of time. Alternatively, I can cover it all up in 1 coat with Demonette hide, and that's a lot more appealing to me. With all the brain base coats dry, I shaded those areas with Magos purple. I've found myself using this color a lot lately. Next I painted some Bonewhite in all the crack areas. I've found it's much easier and faster to just paint over everything when I do the scales, and then touch up with Bonewhite after, rather than try to avoid those areas. The red ends up looking smoother, and because these details are so small, I can get away with only 1 coat of Bonewhite. Then I painted some Gryph-Hound orange in all the cracks. It will get on some of the edges of the skin. It's kind of unavoidable. Don't worry about it, because it will get covered up when we go to highlight the skin anyway. With the Gryph-Hound orange dry, I highlighted all the gills with Dorn yellow. Same thing here with spilling on some of the edges. It's probably going to happen. Just focus on making the highlights as clean as you can, and we'll touch up any mistakes later. I took some thinned Rhinox hide and touched up any of the shadows that needed it. Now to highlight the brains. I used some Gene Stealer purple and highlighted most of the top sections. Next I mixed in some white, about equal parts, and I highlighted the brains again, this time making the line a little more narrow. I mixed in some more white for a third and final highlight, and I applied this more sparingly. Finally, I thinned down some Magos purple with an equal amount of water, and I painted a glaze to tie all the colors together. I used my finger to lightly rub the glaze off the top section. It kind of works like a highlight. Next, I moved on to the skin and applied some glazing and highlights with Bonewhite. Thin the paint down with equal parts water and apply as a glaze to smooth out any areas where the dry brushing looks rough. I also thinned down the Bonewhite even more to apply highlights to the tail and tentacles. You'll want to dilute the paint a lot and have very little on your brush. The result is a transparent layer that allows the base coat to show through. Notice how the highlight almost looks pink on the end of the tail. Build up a couple layers until the highlight is as bright as you like. Now to highlight all the claws with Thunderhawk Blue. I painted this on most of the edges and grooves. On the head spikes, I tried to make the highlight fade out near the center to emphasize the blend. Then I used some Fenrisian Gray to highlight the very edges and corners of the claws. And last, I used some white to highlight the teeth. Faces are usually a focal point, so I like to put a little more detail there. Now for the eyes, which I base coated with Dorn Yellow. I painted them black earlier when I base coated the claws, and I left a little bit of that showing around the eye. When that was dry, I shaded the eyes with some Gryph-Hound orange. Then I highlighted back up with Dorn Yellow, followed by a dot of white in the center. At this stage I wasn't sure where I wanted to go with the eyes, so I left them for now. Later on I ended up deciding to paint a glowing effect, which I'll show in a little bit. Now for my favorite part, and the most time consuming, which is painting all of the red highlights on the scales. I really like the look of the highlights, which is more stylized than it is realistic, so I tended to put more than are sculpted on the model. You can paint as many or as few as you like. Just like the Thunderhawk Blue highlights on the head spike, try to make the red highlights fade a little bit near the center to help emphasize the blended effect. Some areas of the scales may be really dark, and I like to thin down the red with 2 or 3 parts water and paint a glaze highlight. Next, it's time to repeat the highlights on the scales with orange. I like to try and make the lines tapered, like an elongated triangle shape. Very thin and narrow at the start, almost to a point, and then a little wider on the edge of the scale. With all the time-consuming scales out of the way, there are just a few things left to do. I highlighted all the pink areas with some thinned pink horror. Almost like a glaze, but a little stronger. The pink can be used at the end of the tentacles too, depending on how many coats of Magos purple were applied. I mixed some Offwhite into the pink and used this to highlight all the pink areas. You may want to add more or less Offwhite to the mix, depending on how heavy the Magos purple glazing is on the ends of the feet and the hands. Adjust your mix accordingly. Finally, I used some Offwhite on its own and highlighted all of the skin. Just like with the light pink, I used the Offwhite to paint edge highlights, and I also blended some soft highlights with thin glazes. Now to give the eyes a glowing effect. I painted this with Uriel yellow, thinned with about 2 parts water. You'll want barely any paint on the brush, and just start by painting a small amount around the eyes. Just like with the other areas we blended before, you can rinse the brush and smooth out the edge. I let it dry and repeated the process a couple times until the yellow was at a stage that I liked. Then I attached the head to the body with superglue. I coated the base with a generous amount of wood glue. I put on a few pieces of cork, some coarse gravel, and then I dipped the base in fine sand. I painted all the sand and rocks with Rhinox hide. When that was dry, I dry brushed the sand with Mournfang brown, followed by Balor brown, and then Bonewhite. I base coated all the rocks with Dawnstone. I wanted to make the diamond plate flooring to match my Ultramarines army bases, so I painted part of it with Castellan green. I base coated the hazard stripe area with Averland Sunset, and when that was dry, I painted the stripes with black. Then I painted some Iron Hand steel around the edges and cracks. I gave the floor and rocks a generous coat of Agrax Earthshade. The rocks were dry brushed with Dawnstone, followed by a mix of Dawnstone and Bonewhite. I added rust to the metal areas by stippling some thinned Mournfang brown, followed by a small amount of thinned Trollslayer orange. Then I painted all the Tyranid growth areas the same way I painted the skin of the model. I painted the edge of the base with Mournfang brown, and when that was dry, I applied patches of static grass with superglue. And here is the finished emissary in all his terrifying glory. This was a crazy model to paint, and a real challenge to film too. But now that it's all done, I'm really glad I did it. Thank you to everyone who's been following my Tyranid video series, and for all your kind comments and suggestions. The channel is continuing to grow, and as we close in on 5,000 subscribers, I've been thinking about introducing some channel membership options. Does a channel membership interest you? And if so, what kind of perks would you want to see? Any advice or suggestions would be really appreciated. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, happy painting.